This matchup may look like just another old-school hockey game, but it's not what you think, because back in the 1960s, the rivalries between the original six teams were battles that went far beyond the scoreboard. These weren't just games. They were personal wars filled with pride, grit, and the fight for hockey glory. Every time the six teams clashed, the atmosphere was electric, and the intensity on the ice was unlike anything fans had ever seen. The players didn't just skate for wins, they fought for their team's identity and for the respect of an entire generation of fans. If you're enjoying this dive into the greatest rivalries of the 1960s, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps keep this channel going and lets us bring you more hockey stories you'll love. If these rivalries hadn't shaped the 1960s, hockey history would look very different. The fierce battles between the original six created legends, unforgettable playoff moments, and set the standard for toughness in the NHL. Without them, the sport would have lost much of its drama, passion, and lasting legacy. Number 10. Chicago Blackhawks versus Toronto Maple Leafs. In the 1960s, the Chicago Blackhawks and the Toronto Maple Leafs built a rivalry that didn't always get the same headlines as Montreal or Detroit, but it still carried plenty of fire. And what made it so interesting was the clash of styles, and Chicago had Bobby Hull, the Golden Jet, flying down the wing with his booming slap shot, while Toronto relied on a tough, grinding defensive game that frustrated opponents. Every meeting felt like speed and flash against structure and discipline. The Maple Leafs were no strangers to success in the decade. They captured the Stanley Cup 4 times in the 1960s, with their final victory coming in 1967. They had stars like Dave Keon, who was known for his incredible two-way play, and Tim Horton, the rock on defense who later became famous for more than just hockey. The Leafs played smart, patient hockey, and often wore down teams that tried to match their physicality. On the other side, the Blackhawks had one of the most exciting offensive duos in hockey history, Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita. Hull's speed and power made him one of the most feared forwards in the league, while Mikita brought skill, creativity, and later in the decade, a new level of sportsmanship after he transformed his penalty-heavy style into one of discipline. Together, they gave Chicago an explosive attack that could light up any goaltender. When these two teams met, especially in the playoffs, fans knew they were in for a fight. Toronto's defensive system was designed to slow down stars like Hull, and the Leafs' physical players often tried to rough him up before he could get going. But Hull wasn't easily stopped. His slap shot was so powerful it broke sticks, dented boards, and even left goaltenders bruised. Toronto had to be sharp to contain him. One of the most memorable clashes came during the mid-1960s, when both teams were legitimate contenders. Chicago wanted to prove they could rise above the Leafs' grinding style, while Toronto wanted to show their methodical system could neutralize even the league's brightest stars. These matchups didn't just test skill, they tested patience, toughness, and pride. The rivalry may not have had the blood feuds of Boston and the Canadiens, or the national spotlight of Leafs versus Montreal, but it was real and raw. Fans in Chicago hated seeing Toronto come into the old Chicago Stadium and steal wins, while Leafs fans relished shutting down the Golden Jet and silencing the Blackhawks' high-powered attack. For both sides, these games mattered. They weren't just regular season contests, they were statements about who belonged at the top of the NHL in one of its most competitive eras. Number 9. Detroit Red Wings versus New York Rangers. In the 1960s, the Detroit Red Wings and the New York Rangers had a rivalry that didn't always make the biggest headlines, but it was fierce in its own way. Both teams were part of the original six, and every matchup carried the weight of tradition, pride, and the fight for survival in a tough league. The Rangers were hungry for success, while the Red Wings were trying to hang on to their status as one of hockey's great franchises built around the legendary Gordie Howe. Detroit had star power. Howe, often called Mr. Hockey, was still a force in the 1960s. Even in his later years, he combined skill, toughness, and leadership that few players could match. Alongside him, Alex Delvecchio and Norm Ullman gave Detroit a talented core that kept the Wings competitive. The team's style was direct, physical, and relentless. Classic Detroit hockey. The Rangers, meanwhile, were a team constantly pushing to break through. Andy Bathgate was their biggest star in the early 60s, known for his smooth skating and playmaking ability. Bathgate was the face of the franchise until he was traded in 1964. But before that, he was the kind of player who could change a game against anyone, even the great Red Wings. The Rangers also leaned on goaltending, with Gump Worsley in net, a fan favorite with his stocky build and fearless style. When Detroit and New York faced off, the stakes were often about pride and playoff positioning. The Wings had the history and the stars, but the Rangers were scrappy and determined, eager to prove they weren't just a bottom feeder in the original six. Games between the two often turned physical, with Detroit's grinders trying to wear down the Rangers' speed, while New York answered with grit and opportunistic scoring. The matchups may not have carried the same legendary playoff series as some other rivalries, but they were battles that defined the grind of the 1960s NHL. Madison Square Garden and Detroit Olympia were two of the loudest barns in hockey, and when these teams met, fans got their money's worth. The Rangers wanted to topple a team led by Gordie Howe, while the Wings were determined not to let New York leapfrog them in the standings. What makes this rivalry memorable is that it showed the balance of power in the original six wasn't always fixed. On any given night, the Rangers could rise up and frustrate Detroit, and for Wings fans, beating New York was about proving their stars still belonged among the league's elite. It was pride, toughness, and the fight to be noticed in one of hockey's most competitive decades. Number 8, Boston Bruins versus Toronto Maple Leafs. The rivalry between the Boston Bruins and the Toronto Maple Leafs in the 1960s was built on toughness. These weren't games filled with fancy plays or wide open ice. They were battles where every shift came with bruises, and both teams knew they had to outwork, out-hit, and outlast the other. While Toronto was winning championships in the decade, Boston was fighting to prove they could stand toe-to-toe with the Leafs dynasty, and that made their meetings fiery. Toronto had one of the most balanced teams of the 1960s. With Dave Keon leading the charge as one of the smartest two-way players in the game, the Leafs had a steady presence in every part of the ice. They had strong defenders like Tim Horton, who could shut down opponents with his strength, and goaltending that gave them the confidence to grind through close games. Toronto's system was never about blowing teams away. It was about patience, wearing them down, and striking when it mattered most. Against Boston, this style fit perfectly, because the Bruins refused to give them an easy night. The Bruins in the early 1960s were not yet the powerhouse they would become later in the decade, but they had plenty of grit. Even before Bobby Orr arrived in 1966 to change everything, Boston built its reputation on hard-nosed hockey. Players like Johnny Busick, known as the Chief, carried the offense, while the team's physical edge made every battle with Toronto a test of willpower. The Bruins may not have had the trophies to match the Leafs during this era, but they made sure Toronto earned every single win. When these two teams met, especially in the smaller, rowdier arenas of the original six, the atmosphere was intense. Fans in Toronto saw Boston as the team that came to push them around, while Bruins fans wanted nothing more than to see their club spoil the Leafs' run at another cup. The style of play between them created close, grinding games that were decided by who could take the punishment longer. One of the defining elements of this rivalry was that Toronto often came out on top in the standings and in the playoffs. But Boston was never an easy opponent. The Leafs had to fight for their victories, and those battles left marks, sometimes literally. For players and fans, Bruins versus Leafs in the 1960s was about toughness, grit, and proving you could survive the grind of an unforgiving league. It wasn't the flashiest rivalry, but it was one of the toughest. Every time Toronto and Boston hit the ice, it felt less like a game and more like a test of who could endure the punishment of true 1960s hockey. Number 7, New York Rangers versus Montreal Canadiens. In the 1960s, a matchup between the New York Rangers and the Montreal Canadiens felt like two completely different worlds colliding. On one side, you had Madison Square Garden, the big stage of New York City, filled with passionate fans who were desperate for success. On the other, you had the Montreal Forum, the cathedral of hockey, where banners hung from the rafters, and the Canadiens carried themselves like royalty. Whenever these two teams met, the Rangers knew they were facing the ultimate measuring stick. The Canadiens in the 1960s were loaded with talent. Players like Jean Béliveau, Henri Richard, and goaltender Gump Worsley gave Montreal a lineup that seemed unfair at times. They played with elegance, but also with a toughness that could crush opponents. For any team in the league, beating Montreal was never easy, and for the Rangers, it was even more of a challenge. The Habs were chasing cups, while the Rangers were fighting to keep pace in a league where only the best survived. The Rangers, though, were not without their own stars. Andy Bathgate was one of the brightest forwards of his era, a smooth skater and a deadly playmaker who could score against anyone, even Montreal's Hall of Fame goaltenders. In net, the Rangers also had their moments of brilliance, with goaltenders who played fearless hockey in an age when masks were not yet standard. What they lacked in depth compared to Montreal, they made up for in fight and determination. What made this rivalry so captivating was the energy it created. At Madison Square Garden, every time Montreal came to town, the building lit up. Fans wanted to see their Rangers rise to the challenge of the mighty Canadiens. At the Forum, Rangers players often felt the weight of history pressing against them, trying to play their best while thousands of Montreal fans roared. It was more than just another game, it was about proving that New York could skate with the kings of hockey. Even though Montreal usually held the upper hand in the 1960s, the games were far from meaningless. Rangers fans cherished every upset win over the Canadiens, treating it like a small victory against the most powerful team in the league. For the players, those moments built pride and belief that they belonged on the same ice as hockey's elite. The rivalry between the Rangers and Canadiens in this era wasn't about equal footing. It was about the underdog taking swings at a dynasty. And while the Canadiens often walked away with the win, the Rangers never backed down. Every matchup was full of heart, noise, and the feeling that New York was battling more than just a team. They were battling tradition, greatness, and history itself. Number 6, Chicago Blackhawks versus Montreal Canadiens. The rivalry between the Chicago Blackhawks and the Montreal Canadiens reached a notable peak in the early 1960s, centered around one shocking moment in the 1961 playoffs. At that time, Montreal was the league's dynasty, having won 5 straight Stanley Cups from 1956 to 1960, and most fans expected them to keep dominating. But Chicago had other ideas. Led by Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita, the Blackhawks pulled off one of the biggest upsets in NHL history by defeating the mighty Canadiens in the first round, ending their 5-year cup streak. That series changed the way Chicago was viewed and gave this rivalry a fire that burned for the rest of the decade. The Canadiens still had an incredible team throughout the 1960s. With legends like John Béliveau, Henri Richard, and Bernie Boom Boom Geoffrion, they combined elegance with power. They were the model of consistency and the team everyone wanted to beat. For Chicago, facing Montreal wasn't just another game, it was a chance to show they could hang with the very best. The Blackhawks weren't short on talent either. Bobby Hull, known as the Golden Jet, was one of the most electrifying players in hockey history. His speed and blistering slap shot could change a game in an instant. Stan Mikita, his running mate, brought creativity and skill, and by the mid-1960s he had become one of the most disciplined and respected players in the league. Together, Hull and Mikita gave Chicago an attack that made even Montreal sweat. Whenever the Hawks and Canadiens met, the games carried an extra edge. For the Canadiens, it was about defending their reputation as hockey's royalty. For the Blackhawks, it was about proving Chicago's place among the NHL elite. The atmosphere in both the Chicago Stadium and the Montreal Forum made these games unforgettable. In Montreal, the Canadiens were treated like gods, while in Chicago, the roar of the crowd pushed the Hawks to try and match their dynasty rivals. Even when Montreal usually had the upper hand in the standings, Chicago's stars made sure the Canadiens couldn't relax. This rivalry wasn't just about wins and losses, it was about respect. Beating Montreal meant everything in the 1960s, and for Chicago, that upset over the Canadiens in 1961 proved they could do it. The Canadiens may have dominated most of the decade, but the Blackhawks made sure that when the Habs looked over their shoulders, they saw the Golden Jet and the red and black sweaters chasing them down. We're just getting to the very top of the list, and the rivalries only get bigger from here. If you haven't already, drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the countdown. Number 5, Toronto Maple Leafs versus Detroit Red Wings. Few rivalries in the 1960s brought more drama than the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Detroit Red Wings. This wasn't just about regular season games, it was about playoff hockey at its best. The two teams met multiple times in the Stanley Cup final, and those series were the kind of battles that defined an era. Toronto's back-to-back cup wins in 1963 and 1964 came against Detroit, and those victories cemented the rivalry as one of the fiercest of the decade. The Red Wings were powered by Gordie Howe, the face of hockey for 2 generations. Known as Mr. Hockey, Howe could do it all. He could score, pass, and play with a toughness that set him apart. Every time Detroit met Toronto, Howe was the player the Leafs had to contain, and that was no easy task. Alongside him, Norm Ullman and Alex Delvecchio gave the Wings depth and consistency, making them a dangerous opponent for anyone. Toronto, however, had their own stars. Dave Keon was the heart of the Leafs during this period. He was quick, smart, and known for his ability to play both ends of the ice. Keon's calm under pressure made him the perfect leader in those finals, and he often rose to the occasion when his team needed him most. Tim Horton anchored the defense, making life difficult for Howe and the rest of the Wings forwards. Together, Keon and Horton gave Toronto the backbone of a championship team. The 1964 Stanley Cup final between these two clubs was one of the most thrilling in NHL history. The series went the full 7 games, with the Leafs finally pulling out the victory. That win wasn't just another championship, it was proof that Toronto could stand toe-to-toe with one of the toughest teams in the league. Games were close, physical, and filled with tension. Every shift felt like it could change the outcome of the series. What made this rivalry so memorable was the contrast in styles and personalities. Howe's toughness against Keon's smooth play, Detroit's balanced attack against Toronto's disciplined defense. The matchups were tight, and fans never forgot the feeling of those playoff wars. In Detroit, fans packed Olympia Stadium, hoping to see their Wings bring down the Leafs. While in Toronto, Maple Leaf Gardens was alive with energy every time the two teams clashed. Even though Toronto often came out on top in the 1960s, the battles with Detroit gave hockey some of its most iconic moments. Leafs fans still celebrate those victories, while Red Wings fans remember the heartbreak of coming so close. It was classic playoff hockey, hard, fast, and unforgettable, and it remains one of the defining rivalries of the original Six era. Number 4, Boston Bruins versus New York Rangers. The rivalry between the Boston Bruins and the New York Rangers in the 1960s was all about pride. These two East Coast teams weren't always the ones lifting the Stanley Cup, but whenever they faced each other, it felt like a battle for respect. Both teams had loyal fan bases, loud arenas, and a deep desire to prove themselves against their rivals. The Bruins were known for their toughness, even before Bobby Orr arrived in the late 1960s to transform the franchise. In those earlier years, they leaned on players like Johnny Bucyk, nicknamed the Chief, who was their steady scorer and leader. Bucyk wasn't flashy, but he was consistent, dependable, and always ready to grind out a goal. Boston's style reflected their city, hardworking, blue-collar, and physical. They weren't afraid to throw checks and turn games into a test of endurance. The Rangers, on the other hand, carried the flair of New York. Madison Square Garden gave them one of the biggest stages in the sport, and their fans expected them to compete with the very best. In the early 1960s, Andy Bathgate was their superstar. He had a smooth style of play, could create offense from nothing, and carried the hopes of the Rangers night after night. Later in the decade, goaltending would become their strength, with Eddie Jacko Min becoming one of the league's most respected netminders. When Boston and New York met, it was never just another game on the schedule. These were contests that felt personal. The Bruins wanted to show they weren't pushovers, while the Rangers wanted to prove they weren't living in the shadow of Montreal or Toronto. Both teams often sat in the middle of the standings, but their clashes with each other were fiery, physical, and emotional. Fans from both cities fueled the rivalry as well. Boston Garden was loud and unforgiving, while Madison Square Garden brought the energy of New York to every shift. Rangers fans wanted to see their team shut down Boston's physical play, while Bruins fans cheered for their team to rough up the Rangers' stars and grind them into the boards. The games didn't always decide championships, but they mattered deeply to both teams. Beating Montreal or Toronto might have been the dream, but beating each other was the next best thing. Every hit, every fight, every goal carried extra weight because it was about pride and identity. The Bruins and Rangers gave the original Six era some of its most heated East Coast matchups. They weren't the dynasties, but they fought like their legacies depended on it, and in many ways, they did. Number 3, Chicago Blackhawks versus Detroit Red Wings. The rivalry between the Chicago Blackhawks and the Detroit Red Wings was the true Midwest War of the 1960s. These two cities were close in distance, but worlds apart in hockey culture, and that only fueled the hatred. Whenever they met, it was more than a game. It was about bragging rights, toughness, and proving which city ruled the heart of hockey in the Midwest. The Red Wings were led by Gordie Howe, the player everyone simply called Mr. Hockey. Howe wasn't just a scorer. He was a complete player who could hit, defend, and intimidate, while still putting the puck in the net. Alongside him were stars like Alex Delvecchio and Norm Ullman, who gave Detroit one of the strongest lineups in the league. The Wings carried themselves with the confidence of a team that had been among the NHL's elite for years. Chicago, however, was building a force of their own. Bobby Hull, the Golden Jet, was one of the fastest and most powerful players the game had ever seen. His slap shot was legendary, a weapon that could beat goalies clean from long range. Stan Mikita added the brains and creativity to Hull's raw speed and power, giving the Blackhawks a 1-2 punch that made them dangerous every night. Together, Hull and Mikita made sure that Detroit never had an easy game when Chicago was on the other side. What made this rivalry so fierce was the physicality. Games between Detroit and Chicago were often some of the roughest of the decade. Both teams were willing to play hard, throw hits, and turn the ice into a battlefield. Fans loved it because it felt like a fight for territory, with neither side backing down. At Chicago Stadium, the roar of the crowd made the atmosphere intimidating for any visitor, and at Detroit Olympia, Wings fans packed the building to see their team protect their home ice from their closest rivals. There were also playoff meetings that added fuel to the fire. Every series between these two was personal, with stars on both sides carrying the pride of their cities. Hull scoring on Detroit was celebrated loudly in Chicago, while Howe delivering punishment to the Blackhawks drew cheers in Detroit. This rivalry had everything: superstars, physical play, and two fan bases that truly disliked each other. It wasn't just a hockey game, it was a Midwest showdown that gave the NHL some of its most intense moments in the 1960s. For both teams, beating the other wasn't just important, it was essential. Number 2, Montreal Canadiens versus Toronto Maple Leafs. When it comes to Canadian hockey, nothing compares to the rivalry between the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. These two teams weren't just hockey clubs. They were symbols of two great cities and two different hockey traditions. Every time they stepped on the ice in the 1960s, it felt like the entire country was watching. Montreal entered the decade as the NHL's dynasty. With legends like Jean Béliveau, Henri Richard, and goaltenders like Gump Worsley, the Canadiens carried themselves like royalty. They had the banners, the tradition, and the skill to back it up. The Forum in Montreal was a cathedral of hockey, and beating the Habs there was one of the hardest things any team could do. Toronto, however, wasn't intimidated. The Leafs had their own stars and a system that made them one of the toughest teams to play against. Dave Keon was the heart of the Leafs during this era. Quick, smart, and reliable in every situation. Tim Horton anchored the defense, bringing both strength and leadership, while Johnny Bower in goal gave the Leafs confidence to face anyone, even the mighty Canadiens. The highlight of this rivalry in the 1960s came in the 1967 Stanley Cup Final. It was the last final of the original six era and remains one of the most famous series in NHL history. Montreal was heavily favored, stacked with talent, and chasing yet another championship. Toronto, meanwhile, was considered the underdog, with many doubting they could keep up with the Canadiens' skill and depth. But the Leafs had pride, experience, and a never-quit attitude. The series went 6 games, and Toronto shocked the hockey world by winning their 13th Stanley Cup, and their last to this day. Dave Keon's brilliance and Bower's steady goaltending carried the team, while veterans like George Armstrong and Red Kelly provided the leadership that pushed them over the top. That victory wasn't just another championship, it was a defining moment in Canadian sports history. Leafs fans still talk about it with pride, while Canadiens fans remember the sting of losing to their biggest rival on hockey's biggest stage. This rivalry was more than hockey, it was cultural. French-speaking Montreal versus English-speaking Toronto, glamour versus grit, tradition versus tradition. It was Canada's greatest hockey stage, and the 1960s gave it some of its finest chapters. Every meeting between the Canadiens and Leafs felt like a clash of equals, and their battles remain some of the most treasured memories in NHL history. Number 1. Montreal Canadiens versus Boston Bruins. The fiercest rivalry of the 1960s and one of the greatest in hockey history was between the Montreal Canadiens and the Boston Bruins. These two teams had been squaring off since the 1920s, but in the 1960s, the rivalry took on a new level of intensity. Whenever Montreal and Boston met, fans knew they weren't just watching a hockey game, they were watching a battle filled with pride, history, and pure emotion. The Canadiens were the gold standard of the league during this time. Led by stars like Jean Béliveau, Henri Richard, and Jacques Plante in goal earlier in the decade, they carried themselves with the confidence of champions. Montreal's mix of skill, speed, and discipline made them the team everyone measured themselves against. Facing the Habs meant you were taking on hockey's royalty, and no team hated that challenge more than the Boston Bruins. The Bruins in the early 1960s were scrappy and determined. They didn't yet have Bobby Orr, who would arrive in 1966 to completely change the franchise, but they still had grit and leadership from players like Johnny Busick. The Bruins knew they had to use toughness to compete with Montreal's finesse, and their games often turned into physical wars. Montreal had the skill, but Boston brought the bruises, and that made their meetings unforgettable. What added to the rivalry was the passion of the fans. The Montreal Forum was one of the loudest and proudest arenas in hockey, while Boston Garden gave the Bruins a home crowd that matched their rough and tumble style. When the two teams met in either building, the atmosphere was electric. Canadiens fans loved reminding Boston of Montreal's dominance, while Bruins fans lived for the chance to knock the mighty Habs off their throne. Playoff meetings between these teams added even more fuel to the fire. Montreal often had the upper hand, but Boston never made it easy. The games were filled with hard checks, dramatic saves, and the kind of tension that kept fans on the edge of their seats. Every goal felt enormous, every fight felt personal, and every win was celebrated like a championship. This rivalry captured everything the NHL was about in the 1960s: toughness, tradition, and the fight for respect. The Canadiens may have been the dynasty, but the Bruins gave them battles that fans still talk about today. Montreal versus Boston wasn't just the greatest rivalry of the decade, it was the rivalry that defined what it meant to be an original six team. These rivalries made the 1960s one of the greatest decades in NHL history. Some were about pride, some were about revenge, and all of them gave us unforgettable hockey moments. Which rivalry do you think was the fiercest of them all? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be the first to see our next deep dive into hockey history.